morning.
Good morning.
Could you please say your name and then spell your last name for the record?
Glenn Cranfield, Cranfield.
And Reverend Cranfield, where do you work?
I work at Nashville Rescue Mission.
And in what capacity do you work there?
I'm the president and CEO.
Okay. And for those of us who aren't familiar with the Nashville Rescue Mission, can you just explain what that organization is and what it does?
It's a homeless shelter and rehabilitation center for those that are struggling with issues such as drugs and alcohol and so forth. We house about average 800 people per night on 2 campuses, one for women and children, one for men. And we have a life recovery program for those that are dealing with alcohol and drug addiction of about 200 individuals.
In your capacity as the CEO and president, what does your sort of day-to-day look like? What do you do for the rescue mission in that capacity?
Since COVID-19 has drastically changed, but generating or having meetings with my leaders, senior leaders, and directing aspects throughout the day, fundraising, PR, media, so forth, and just checking in on how things are going throughout the mission.
Were you employed in that capacity as CEO and president during April and May of this year?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you said things have sort of drastically changed because of COVID-19. Did something happen around that time frame related to COVID-19 that brings you to court today?
Well, I believe it was it was Wednesday, the week that April ended, so April 30 or so forth. We were informed that there would be a mass testing of the individuals at the men's center and all the staff and so forth, and that would be happening the next morning at 9 a.m. And so we had the previous months to that from probably March through the end of April been really changing our behavior, social distancing, and so forth. And we had opened up with partnership with the Metro, the fairgrounds, which allowed us to social distance at the mission. So we were able to place some of the men, particularly at the fairgrounds, which allowed us to space out so much at the mission. But then, like I said, at the last day of April, we were informed there'd be a mass testing the following day.
Okay. When you say mass testing, just to clarify, that's mass testing for COVID-19?
Correct.
Okay. And you were told that the day before?
The evening on Wednesday, I'm sorry, the dates, but the evening on Wednesday, we were informed that would be happening at 9 a.m. the following morning.
Okay. Was your understanding that testing was mandatory?
Yes.
Okay. To your knowledge, did folks have the right to refuse to do that testing?
No, ma'am.
And who was tested?
The testing was being completed by the Metro Public Health Department.
Okay. And was it everybody at the mission, staff, guests? Who at the mission was being tested for COVID-19?
Everybody, staff, guests, program participants, everybody at the mission.
I want to fast forward to the testing happens. When did you get the results back?
The test actually occurred on Thursday, and the test came in over the weekend. We received some on Saturday, and then the others on Sunday.
Do you know who communicated those results to you?
Metro Public Health communicated those in email to us as they came in. The individual, I'm not certain of that.
Okay. Who was the point person for the Nashville Rescue Mission with respect to coordinating this testing and the results and all of that?
Norman Humber.
Okay. To your knowledge, was there any discussion with any guest? And when I say guests, we're talking about individuals experiencing homelessness. Is that right? That's what you refer to as the folks who stay at the shelter. So to your knowledge, was there any discussion with any guest about where they could safely quarantine?
No, ma'am. That was one of the reasons why we wanted to ask for a little bit of a space between finding out they were going to test and the actual testing, so that we could communicate with the guests, because the anxiety level was already high. And then to tell them that this morning we're going to do mass testing with no communication or awareness or really conversation with them was troublesome to us. And so we didn't have an opportunity until they received their actual test results to tell them they'd be going to the fairgrounds.
Okay. To your knowledge, were they given any additional options about where they could quarantine?
Not to my knowledge.
Do you know if they were asked if they had family members or friends that they could stay with?
No, ma'am.
Were they asked if they wanted to quarantine using their own camping equipment?
No, ma'am.
So to your knowledge, the only option that was given to the guests, the individuals experiencing homelessness, was to go to the fairgrounds facility. And when I say option, was that actually optional?
Actually, no, they were ordered to go to the fairgrounds.
Okay. So the guests who tested positive were required to go to the fairgrounds.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about what the fairgrounds facility actually looks like. So have you visited that facility?
I have.
And did you see it on or around the time that that these events took place in April and May of this year?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you describe it for us?
Wide open area with lots of opportunity to social distance the bunk beds. It was just primarily just a place for bunk beds. They did have through one of the little areas there, which they would serve meals through Second Harvest Food Bank, which was nice, but it was all of the area in which they were living was just really a huge, massive dorm.
Okay, so not separate individual spaces?
No, ma'am.
So was it like cots that were set up 6 feet apart? Is that?
Yes,
okay.
There were cots that were set up 6 feet apart. Yes, ma'am.
All right. When you visited, were there any communal phones, like a phone for someone who doesn't have a cell phone to be able to use at that facility?
No, not when I visited. I was not aware of any pay phone or communal phone to be used.
Okay. Were you aware of any communal computers that people who were quarantined there were able to use?
No, we had advocated for those, but those were not in place at the time.
Okay. To your knowledge, was Mr. Kirkley given any sort of hearing prior to his transport to the fairgrounds facility?
Not to my knowledge.
We've been talking about the guests, individuals experiencing homelessness who were required to go to the fairgrounds facility. I want to shift now and talk about the staff members at the rescue mission. Were there any staff members or employees who tested positive?
Yes, just to be clear, there were 100, interesting that the number was a whole number, but there were 100 guests that experienced tested positive, 5 program participants, and 4 staff members.
Okay. So about 4 staff members
yes,
who tested positive. Did Metro Public Health require that those staff members be quarantined?
The staff members were allowed to travel to and from home, and then those that actually, for those that were tested, and then for those that were quarantined, they were allowed to just return to their home. Okay. During the time period.
Did Metro Public Health give you any instructions about what to do about the staff members who tested positive?
No, ma'am.
Okay. What did you do?
We asked them to stay home.
And was that
during the 10 days of the quarantine period?
Was that just an internal policy that you developed?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Were they issued quarantine orders from Metro Public Health?
They were not.
Not even a quarantine order to quarantine within their own home?
No, ma'am.
What steps did the mission take to advise staff once you received news that there were staff members who were positive? What steps did the mission leadership take to advise them and to tell them what to do?
Well, we met with our HR department, and we then communicated to those that tested positive that the quarantine order was for the entire campus would be 10 days. And so we asked them that they stay home for 10 days, and they would continue to be paid during that time period, but that we need them to stay home and quarantine for 10 days.
To your knowledge, did Metro Public Health follow up with any of the staff who tested positive?
Not to my knowledge.
So to your knowledge, only guests who tested positive were issued quarantine orders?
That's correct.
And staff were not issued quarantine orders at all?
That was kind of left to us.
Just a moment, Your Honor.
All right. Cross-examination?
Is it Reverend Cranfield?
Yes, sir. Good morning.
Good morning. It'd be fair to say that the health and welfare of your staff and guests, anyone who comes about the rescue mission, either campus, is a significant priority for you.
Certainly.
And one of the reasons for the mission is to help people who are experiencing homelessness or whatever may have led them to not have a roof over their heads, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And how long has the rescue mission been in existence?
66 years.
All right. And how long have you been associated with the mission?
February 2012, since that time period. February 6th, that's 2012.
So about eight of the 54 years.
8.5 years.
8.5 years.
66
Six
years.
total. All right. And the campus has, or the rescue mission campus has been in different locations over the years. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And the location where the testing was conducted with the male residents, was that the 8th Avenue? Or,
It's actually 639 Lafayette.
oh, and the Lafayette address. Oh, okay. All right. As opposed to the Rosa Parks. There is a rescue
Sir.
mission auxiliary.
Rosa Parks is women
It's
and
Rosa
children.
Parks. That's what I thought. Okay. So were you present during all of the times that the health department personnel were at the rescue mission?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Do you actually live there, live on campus?
No.
All right. And with respect to,
I felt like I've lived there the last 6 months.
well, I would think so. And the health of your guests is still a day-to-day priority, correct?
Yes.
And following the directives of the emergency orders and the orders issued by the health department is one of the things you try to comply with, correct?
Yes.
Because you referenced social distancing, masks,
Hand sanitizing.
hand sanitizer.
Buying machines to do misting and so forth, yes.
Exactly. And I don't want to try to in any way violate any HIPAA, but are you aware of any positive tests, say, in the last week at the mission?
I'm not sure what was relevant to this procedure.
General, how is that relevant?
Judge, I would just think it's his question about this whole thing, is it constitutional? I know we're not getting into the merits, or at least we assume we're not getting into the merits of Mr. Kirkley specifically, but whether the following of the orders of the health department, I submit, is relevant, that is still an ongoing issue. That's fine, I'll move on.
Right, I don't think it's relevant, but please just move on. Thank you.
I will. Reverend Cranfield, do you have any background in medicine?
No, I do not.
What is your educational background, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, I don't mind you asking. I have a bachelor's of music education degree and then also a ministry degree out of Springfield, Missouri, Assemblies of God.
Okay.
And I've been a pastor for several years and then came to Nashville in 2006 to lead the mission.
Okay. When is the last time that you have visited the fairgrounds complex?
It was right after the second week of May.
Okay. And so you haven't been back since?
No, sir.
Okay. Do you know whether or not Mr. Kirkley requested a hearing about his quarantine?
I'm not aware.
May I have this motion?
Certainly.
Do you have any personal knowledge as to whether or not Mr. Kirkley was asked whether he had an alternative place to quarantine?
Individually, as an individual, no. As a group, they were not.
Okay. And you were there for that?
Yes.
That's all right.
All right. Can you redirect? Thank you. You can step down. Call your next witness.
Defense calls Madeline McCormick.
Raise your right hand and be sworn, please, ma'am. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, so help you God? All right.
Good morning. Can you please say your name and then spell your last name for the record?
Madeline McCormick, MCCORMICK.
Where are you employed, Ms. McCormick?
I'm sorry, Ms. Dredd. I wear bilateral hearing aids.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll try to speak up.
Thank you.
Where are you employed?
Metro Public Health Department.
Okay. In what capacity are you employed there?
My title is Regional Hospital Coordinator.
And as the regional hospital coordinator, what sort of things are you tasked with doing for the public health department?
So there's COVID normal and normal. During normal times, I'm part of a federal grant program that works toward emergency preparedness for mostly hospitals and non-hospital entities like nursing homes. And we do training, purchase equipment, things like that. During COVID times, it's a lot of batting cleanup, a little bit of everything.
Were you working in that capacity during what we'll call COVID times, April and May of this year?
Yes.
Okay. Were you involved in Metro Public Health's mass testing during that time frame at the Nashville Rescue Mission?
Yes.
How were you involved in that?
In an administrative capacity. For the testing on ground at Nashville Rescue Mission, I was not present for the actual testing, but in arranging with mostly Norman Humber, trying to coordinate the mass testing in response to an index case that had stayed at the mission and had exposed people.
Okay, so there was an index case and that's how y'all decided we need to test everybody?
Yes.
Okay. We've already heard some testimony about the testing itself, so I want to just skip ahead to kind of what happened after the test results came back.
Sure.
The testing was done on a Thursday, is that right?
It would have been the 30th, April 30th.
Okay. And then when did the results come back?
Saturday.
Okay. Did you send a list of all of the results for staff and guests at the mission to Norman Humber and Glenn Cranfield?
Yes, and it actually would have been test results were rolling in on Saturday and Sunday. Okay. So yes.
And again, that list included both guests who had tested positive and then also staff who had tested positive.
Yes. On our end, when the results came through the lab, there was no delineation between staff and guests.
Okay. But you're aware that had all of the test results for everybody at the mission, including staff?
Yes.
Okay. Are you aware of whether or not Mr. Kirkley, the defendant in this case, was on that list of positive results that came back?
No.
Okay. Are you aware of the mission staff member, Marvin Champion? Are you aware whether he was on that list of positive results that came back?
No.
Would seeing the list of results that you sent to Norman and to Glenn Cranfield help refresh your recollection about whether those folks were on that list?
Sure.
Have these put into evidence. I guess we could.
Your Honor, I just showed to opposing counsel that I'd like to mark just for identification as, I guess, Exhibit 1. May I approach?
Certainly.
All right, Ms. McCormick, I'm handing up what's been marked as Exhibit 1 for identification. Do you know what that is? Does that look familiar to you?
It's what we call a line list.
Okay, what does that mean?
It is a list of people's names and identifying factors like date of birth.
Okay. Is that list in any discernible order, like alphabetical order?
No, this is not.
Okay. I'm going to give you just a minute to look through and see if you can find those two individuals. If not, we can move on, because I do know that I'm realizing now it's going to be a little bit difficult for her to find those individual names if they're not in alphabetical order, but I'll give you a couple minutes. It would be Mr. Kirkley, who goes by Hank, and it would be Marvin Champion.
And did you mark on which page? I'm sorry,
I didn't. If I can actually, we can move on, and I can kind of refresh your recollection with maybe an easier document.
Sure.
Okay. Who did you send that list of results to? Do you remember?
I think it would have been Glenn and Norman, and likely some internal folks on the response team.
Okay. So in addition to the list of results, you also sent instructions about what to do with the guests who had tested positive. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And what were those instructions?
I've sent a lot of emails since April.
Yes.
I'm assuming it was get people who have tested positive separated away from people who have tested negative, and isolate them as much as possible. And at that point, we would have been arranging transportation through MNPS school buses.
Okay.
And those would have been set to arrive at a certain time. It was all very a truncated timeline, if you will, because you're trying to limit exposure.
About how long would you say between when the test results got communicated and when folks were transported to the fairgrounds?
I'm sorry.
About how long would you say would it have been between when you communicated the results to when folks were actually transported to the fairgrounds?
Within an afternoon.
Okay. And you instructed them that all of the guests who tested positive would be transported to the fairgrounds, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that was, again, just for guests at the mission. So only guests who tested positive would be transported to the fairgrounds.
Yes.
The plan was not to transport any staff members of the rescue mission to the fairgrounds facility.
Unless staff lived on campus and had no other option.
Okay. So we just talked about the instructions that you gave to Norman and to Glenn about how to deal with the folks who had tested positive. Guests were not given an alternative to quarantining at the fairgrounds, correct?
Correct.
They weren't asked if they had an alternative safe place to quarantine?
The assumption was made that if they were living at the mission, there was no other place for them to quarantine.
Okay, so that was an assumption. It wasn't something that you asked each person individually?
At that point, no.
Okay. And they weren't offered any sort of alternative at that point to quarantining at the fairgrounds?
Yeah, Mentor did not have any other options.
Okay. I want to talk to you about the actual quarantine orders. So when were those quarantine orders issued?
They would have been issued on arrival at the fairgrounds.
On arrival at the fairgrounds, so they wouldn't have been sent to Norman and Glenn, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Your Honor, I've just showed opposing counsel what we will mark as for identification as Exhibit 2. Passing this up to the witness.
Thank you.
Ms. McCormick, do you know what that document is?
It's a copy of a health directive.
Okay, what is the health directive?
A health directive is given to folks who have either not been able to be contacted by a Metro Public Health investigator and given verbal instructions over the phone in regards to their positive status and quarantine procedures, or if somebody has admitted to non-compliance with quarantine.
And is that an order to quarantine by the Metro Public Health Department?
This would be, yes.
Okay. Who does that order appear to be for?
Mr. Kirkley.
Okay, Randle Kirkley?
Yes.
Okay. Did he sign that document?
It is marked refused.
Okay, what does that mean?
That means that he refused to sign it, which is allowable in the quarantine orders. The quarantine order still applies whether or not you sign it.
Okay. And so that was issued to him at the fairgrounds facility once he got there.
Yes, for quarantine.
Does that appear to be a true and accurate reflection of the order that was given to Mr. Kirkley?
Yes, this is at that point in time, this would have been the version that we used.
Okay. And just to kind of describe the order for the record. So it's sort of it's like a form document, and then there's a place to fill in someone's name.
Yes.
And then is there also a place to fill in where they're supposed to quarantine?
Yes.
And where does it say Mr. Kirkley was supposed to quarantine?
Quarantine at the fairgrounds.
At the fairgrounds, okay. Your Honor, at this point, I would move this into evidence as Exhibit 1. Exhibit 2, sorry, Your Honor.
All right, Exhibit 2, it'll be admitted.
So we've been talking specifically about what Metro Public Health did with the folks who were experiencing homelessness, who tested positive at the mission. I want to shift to the staff members who tested positive at the mission. Sure. So there were several staff members during that first round of testing that tested positive. Is that right?
To my recollection, sure.
Okay. And as we discussed, the email instructions that you sent, those were only instructions about what to do with guests who tested positive, right?
Yes.
And those instructions, again, were that they were required to go to the fairgrounds facility.
Sure.
You did not send any instructions to the rescue mission about what to do with their staff, did you?
In writing, no. I had verbal conversations.
Okay, what were those conversations?
It would have most likely been with just Norman. I think there had occasionally been a speakerphone conversation with Glenn and Norman. And it was mostly about the time period of quarantine. So from date of test, it is 10, usually guidelines have changed, and I can't remember at which date they changed. Currently, it's 10 days of an isolation or quarantine period with the last 24 hours of being afebrile and feeling well. I think at that point in time, it would have been 72 hours of afebrile and feeling well. And that they should not have any staff who tested positive on site till at least 10 days after the date of testing.
Okay. You didn't issue any quarantine orders for those individuals, correct?
No, at that point, they would have been verbally notified.
Okay.
And so they would,
sorry, go ahead, continue.
so they would not have received a quarantine order unless for some reason we could not get in touch with them or they had indicated to a monitor or someone that they were not in compliance or were leaving their house.
Okay. So guests get the quarantine orders when they get to the fairgrounds facility, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And the staff were just, you told the rescue mission, hey, make sure that your staff stay home for 10 days.
Yes.
Was MNPH involved at all in any of the rest of the policies that the rescue mission developed on what to do with their staff who had tested positive, or was that sort of the extent of your conversation?
I'm sorry, could you?
Sorry, yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's my fault. So the extent of the instructions or conversations that you had were, these are what the guidelines are, develop a policy that sort of complies with those guidelines. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's correct.
And again, no quarantine orders issued to any of the staff who tested positive.
To my knowledge, correct.
Okay. Just a moment, Your Honor.
All right.
Nothing further at this time. Thanks.
All right. Cross-examination?
We'd have just 1 second, Your Honor.
All right.
When somebody is, can you hear me?
A little closer. Sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry. After somebody tests positive and they need to isolate or quarantine away from other people, it's important that a person, that when they're quarantining, it is the least restrictive constraint upon a person's liberty. Is that right? Your Honor, it's the law. and she's required to follow the law.
I'll let her answer the question if she can.
Is it important that that when somebody is asked to quarantine, it's under the least restrictive constraint on a person's liberty? Is that right?
I mean, I think I would fundamentally agree with that.
Okay. If somebody has another place to go, then they wouldn't be asked to go to a particular place. Is that right?
Yes.
And is that the reason why there was a difference between people who were staff who worked at the Nashville Rescue Mission were verbally spoken to and not given a quarantine order?
Yes, and often with folks who are experiencing homelessness, if a family member is able to step in and say, I have a spare bedroom or I have a place they can stay, that's where they quarantine. And then they are not always issued a quarantine order.
Okay, and if somebody were to give that information to somebody with the health department, would they be permitted to go to another place other than the fairgrounds?
Yes.
And do you have any personal knowledge about whether or not a conversation like that was had with Mr. Kirkley?
I'm not aware of any said conversation.
Okay, you don't know whether or not a conversation like that occurred?
No.
Can I redirect? All right, thank you. You can sit down. Call your next witness.
Defense called Marvin Humber.
Are you?
Sir, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, so help you God?
Good morning. Could you please say your name and then spell your last name for the record?
Norman Humber, Humber.
And Mr. Humber, where are you employed?
Nashville Rescue Mission.
In what capacity?
Title is Chief of Staff.
Were you working in that capacity during April and May of this year?
Yes.
And around that time frame, were you involved in the mass COVID-19 testing that happened at the rescue mission?
Yes, ma'am.
How were you involved in that?
I was the missions liaison with the Metro Health Department.
As the liaison, were you involved in sort of receiving information and emails and instructions from Metro Public Health about that testing that happened?
Correct.
At some point, did you receive an email with the testing results from that Thursday, that April 30th mass testing date?
Correct.
Did that email contain staff and guests or just guests?
Staff and guests, everybody that was tested.
Once you got that email, that list of folks who had tested positive, were you given any instructions about what to do with that information?
Yeah, actually before we received the test results, we had a host testing procedure that was set about between the mission and Metro Health.
What was that post-testing procedure?
It was, it's exactly in the email, but the best recollection in my head is that we were going to conduct a test. Once the tests were complete, we were going to get a line detail of individuals, and those that were positive that is and staying at the mission or their address as the mission, we were going to gather them together and then transported that group out to the fairgrounds positive shelter.
The instructions that you received about what to do with the guests that tested positive, did those instructions say that all of the guests would be transported to the fairgrounds facility?
All of the positive tests, yes, ma'am.
Okay. To your knowledge, was Mr. Kirkley one of those guests?
Correct.
Were you sent quarantine orders for each of the guests who tested positive?
We were sent on, I believe it was Monday, it was a quarantine letter for all of the individuals at the fairgrounds. They were going to be given a quarantine letter there instead of at the mission.
Okay. To your knowledge, were guests given any other option to choose where they were going to quarantine safely?
No, if they had the address of 639 Lafayette, then we were going to, for the keeping the well at the mission, we were going to transport them at a facility out there that could handle the positive cases.
So it was sort of a foregone conclusion. Guests test positive, they go to the fairgrounds.
Correct.
Right. To your knowledge, no discussion with guests about whether they had another safe place to go.
There might have been some individual one-off conversations. I could stay at my brother's, but what we did as the mission was to transport them out so that the whole group could be medically treated and looked after.
Okay, so nobody was taken no guests from the rescue mission were quarantined elsewhere other than the fairgrounds facility, to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, yes, ma'am.
To your knowledge, was Mr. Kirkley given a hearing before he was transported to the fairgrounds?
A hearing?
A hearing.
What do you mean?
And any type of hearing, either before a judge, a magistrate, any type of hearing to be heard on whether he would be taken to the fairgrounds?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, so I want to switch to staff now. Did you receive instructions about what to do with the staff who tested positive?
The only instructions were that we were following our protocol, that at the National Rescue Mission protocol, that if an individual tested positive or they were symptomatic, would send them home, but especially if they had a test, they would be quarantined at their residence, at their.
Right, and that was a policy that the rescue mission leadership developed.
Yeah, that was done way before the testing, but yes, ma'am.
Was one of those staff members who tested positive Marvin Champion, to your knowledge?
Yes.
Were you given any instructions other than, follow your own policy by Metro Public Health about what to do with the staff?
No, ma'am.
To your knowledge, were any quarantine orders issued to any of the staff members who tested positive?
Quarantine orders, there was a letter that was given I think it was on the 4th.
Okay. Was that an order, a formal order for them to quarantine that was punishable by prosecution?
It was a directive from, I don't know all the intricacy of it, but it was a directive from Metro Health saying that you have tested positive and you need to quarantine for 14 days.
Okay. Were they told where to quarantine specifically?
I think in the letter, it just says, I think in your house.
Okay.
They were not specifically, at your house. We did not specifically say at your house, but at your residence.
Okay. So was that a directive by the rescue mission or by Metro Public Health?
It was, let's see, it was a directive from the health department. We carried it out by saying you're an employee, you need to go home and be quarantined for.
Okay, so those were sent to you, those directives or those letters?
We've got a directive that was sent on the Monday afterwards of the quarantine order.
And was it a general?
Yes.
Okay, so we're talking about a general directive that said you need to make sure that your staff
It's a general letter that puts in, Norman Humber's name or whatever person's name, and here are the instructions.
Right. Were the staff required to sign anything, to your knowledge? Okay. Just a moment, Your Honor.
All right.
Nothing further.
All right. Cross-examination.
Mr. Humber, at the time of the testing with the positive results, did Mr. Champion live at the mission?
No.
That's all, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you. You can step down.
Thank you.
Call your next witness.
Defense calls Marvin Champion.
Sir, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, so help you God? All right, step right around.
Good morning, sir. Can you say your name and then spell your last name for the record, please?
Marvin Champion, Champion,
What county do you live in, Mr. Champion?
in Davidson County,
Where are you employed?
National Rescue Mission.
And what do you do for the rescue mission?
I'm a cook.
How long have you been there for?
It'll be 2 years in October.
Okay. Were you working as a cook at the rescue mission in April and May of this year?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And around that time frame, were you involved in the mass COVID-19 testing that was done at the mission?
Yes, I was.
What happened? So you were tested for COVID-19, correct?
Yes.
What happened when your test result came back on either Saturday or Sunday?
It was a Sunday. They came to me and told me I tested positive and explained to me I have to go to quarantine. So I went to my apartment. I stayed in my apartment.
Okay. When you say they, who was that?
Miss Mary right there.
Okay. And Miss Mary, is she an employee of the rescue mission?
Yes.
Okay. Did anyone from Metro Public Health ever talk to you?
Yes.
Okay. When did they talk to you?
I want to say the following Monday or Tuesday, something.
Okay. But they were not the ones who communicated your test result to you?
No.
Okay. Were you ever asked to sign anything related to your COVID-19 testing?
I think I was when I came back to work.
Back to work. Okay. Nothing before you were quarantined?
No.
Okay. Did anyone ever come to your house or your apartment while you were quarantining to knock on the door and check and see if you were actually quarantining?
No, they called me.
Okay. Who called you?
My boss.
Okay. Your boss. Did you ever see any police officers outside your home checking to make sure that you were quarantining?
No.
Okay. Just a moment, Your Honor.
All right.
Nothing further.
Did you follow the quarantine instructions?
Cross-examination.
Mr. Champion, so you had a place to go, a separate residence to go to do your quarantine?
Yes.
And did you follow the rules of the quarantine?
Yes, I did.
Those are my questions, Your Honor.
All right. Can you redirect? Thank you. You can step down. You call your next witness.
Next witness is Jessie Call.
Oh, sorry. I just have to
Sir, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, so help you God?
Good morning. Can you say your name and then spell your last name for the record, please?
Jessie Call, Call.
Mr. Call, how are you employed?
I'm employed at the Salvation Army as program director.
Okay. Are you a member of any other group in addition to your role at the Salvation Army?
Yes, I'm part of the Continuum of Care for Nashville and the Nashville Homeless Planning Council.
Okay. Can you explain to us what the Continuum of Care and the Homelessness Planning Council are?
They are the organization that the city has established to help funnel resources and collaborate to serve citizens experiencing homelessness in Nashville.
Okay. Do you have any sort of governing or regulatory authority as that council?
They have authority over the funding that is given to the city through HUD. It is appointed. Some of the positions are appointed by the mayor, but that's pretty much the scope of the authority. Okay.
And fair to say that council is sort of involved in all aspects of addressing homelessness in Nashville?
Yes.
Okay. As a member of that council, was your council ever consulted in the development of the fairgrounds facility?
No.
Sorry?
No.
No, okay. Was that council ever consulted about how to address the COVID-19 pandemic as it relates to the homelessness population?
Not until after the fact.
Okay, and when was after the fact?
After the fairgrounds shelter had been established, part of the reason for that was the Homelessness Planning Council didn't have a way to meet. They were still making the rules about how to do electronic meetings.
Okay. Did they ever attempt to set up a Zoom meeting or some sort of electronic meeting about the fairgrounds facility and its development?
No.
Okay. In addition to your role on the Homelessness Planning Council, you said that you work at the Salvation Army. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what does the Salvation Army do?
The Salvation Army does a lot of things, but my program is a shelter program and an outreach program for individuals experiencing homelessness.
Okay. Were you employed in that capacity? Have you been employed in that capacity for the past several months?
Yes.
Okay. Did Metro Public Health at some point conduct mandatory COVID-19 testing at the Salvation Army facility?
No.
Okay. Were individual guests tested who stayed at that facility?
Yes.
Okay.
We invited Neighborhood Health to come to our facility to conduct testing after we knew of somebody that had been exposed. And then as a result of those tests, when they came back positive, the health department became involved.
Okay. And how did they become involved?
They were notified by Neighborhood Health that we had several positive cases.
Okay. And did those positive cases include individuals staying at the shelter and staff members?
Yes.
Okay. How were the staff treated as compared to the guests who had positive tests?
The staff were just given a secondary test while they were there and then just advised to quarantine on their own. And that was pretty much the extent of it.
Okay. Did they ever receive quarantine orders from Metro Public Health to your knowledge?
No.
Okay. And what about the guests?
No orders were given to them either.
Okay. Were they transported to the fairgrounds facility?
Yes. Anyone who had tested positive was transported to the facility for at least a few days.
Okay. And when you say anyone, you mean anyone who was staying at the facility?
Anyone who was staying at the facility.
So
the
not
staff. Not staff.
Okay. Were they given any alternatives of where to quarantine safely, the guests?
No.
Okay. To your knowledge, were there any guests who had alternative safe places to stay?
There was somebody that was looking into a different place. He was talking with family members about having a place to stay because he preferred to go there as opposed to the fairgrounds.
Okay. And what happened to that guest?
He was not given the opportunity to complete that process. He was instructed that he had to go immediately to the fairground shelter.
Just a moment. Nothing further at this time.
Okay. Cross-examination.
Has anyone who was at the fairgrounds reached out to you or your organization about helping them find another place to stay other than the fairgrounds?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Did Mr. Kirkley reach out to you about trying to find another place to stay?
No.
Okay, and if somebody had reached out to you and asked for your assistance in helping them find another place to stay to quarantine, would you have done your best to help them make that happen?
Yes.
Okay, and after the person that you just testified about was asked to go immediately to the fairgrounds, do you know whether or not that person was ever able to find another place to stay other than the fairgrounds?
He did not.
Okay, and so you don't know that what if he was able to find another place to stay, was it your understanding that he would have been permitted to go to this other place?
I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Redirect? Thank you. Let's step back. Call your next witness, please.
Shay Fowler. Shay Fowler.
Shay Fowler.
I'm just not answering the call.
Oh, she was just here this morning. I can move to another witness. Maybe she's just in the restroom. Susan Adcock.
Susan A.
Ma'am, do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, so help you God?
I do.
All right.
Good morning. Can you say your name and then spell your last name for the record, please?
My name is Susan Adcock, and that's Adcock.
Where are you employed?
I'm employed at Open Table Nashville.
Okay. For those of us who aren't familiar with that organization, can you just explain a little bit about what it is and what it does?
Open Table is an outreach organization. We help people who are experiencing literal homelessness survive outdoors and in camps, and also with housing.
Okay. What capacity are you employed with Open Table?
I'm an outreach worker and resource navigator.
How long has Open Table been in Nashville, working in Nashville with this population for?
A little over 10 years.
And as sort of a thought leader in the space, are you typically involved in development of policies and procedures through the city about how the homeless population is treated or how certain things impact the homeless population here?
We try to stay involved and do as much as we can to advocate for people.
Was Open Table ever consulted about the fairgrounds facility?
No.
How did you find out about it?
I believe I found out about it through a mass email, and possibly at a staff meeting.
Okay. And was that before or after it had already been developed and set up?
It had already been set up.
Were you ever consulted in any way, either by Metro Public Health or the mayor's office, about the best way to approach the COVID-19 pandemic with our homeless population here?
No, not at all.
Were you ever asked whether Open Table could provide some alternative safe means of quarantine?
No.
If you had been consulted, could you have provided alternative quarantine measures?
Yes.
Okay, what would you have done?
We would have collected supplies, tent, tarp, sleeping bag, food, water, anything that anyone could have needed, camp spot if necessary.
Okay. Is that something that you already do as part of your organization?
Yes, regularly.
Was there other funding, to your knowledge, available related to quarantine of individuals for the COVID-19?
Yes, around the city there was other funding. I can't be specific about where that was.
Okay, and do you know what that funding was for specifically?
I don't.
Okay. Are you familiar with the community care funds? I believe I'm saying that right.
Yes.
Okay, and what do they do?
During COVID, they received some grant money that would allow them to put people in motel rooms,
Okay,
which they did, I think, about 15 to 18 people.
okay. And to just quickly go back to the camping equipment, so that would have been equipment provided to folks so they could camp in isolation, is that right?
Yes.
And do you have the ability to check in on those folks, provide food, things like that?
I do. Since the very beginning, we, for the first 4 months, we delivered food daily. And anything that anyone called us and said they needed, we provided that as well. So I could have checked on them Monday through Friday, given them enough on Friday to last through the weekend.
And that would have been an alternative quarantine measure that would have been available had you been consulted?
Yes.
Just a minute. Nothing.
All right. Cross-examination?
Ms. Adcock, I take it that you are individually fairly well-known to the homeless community, correct?
I am, yes.
All right. And to your knowledge, has anyone reached out to you from the fairgrounds or anywhere else to ask for alternative quarantine that you would provide?
They have not.
Okay. Have you supervised, monitored, whatever the right word might be, someone who is under a quarantine order, a homeless person?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. So be fair to say that what you're saying that you could do, you've not been asked to do.
I've not been asked to do that, no.
That's all right.
All right. Can you redirect? Thank you. Sit down. Call your next witness, please.
Shay Fowler.
Now, would you raise your right hand and be sworn? Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, so help you God?
Good morning. Could you say your name and then spell your last name for the record, please?
Shay Fowler, Fowler.
What county do you live in, Ms. Fowler?
Davidson,
Where are you employed?
the Salvation Army,
And what do you do for them?
the men's case manager.
Were you involved, were you working in that capacity in April and May of this year?
Yes,
Okay. Were you involved in COVID-19 testing that was done, I guess, with Neighborhood Health and then in conjunction with the Metro Public Health Department?
yes.
Okay. Can you tell us what happened?
I got tested and was told my test was positive, and was told that I had to be quarantined for 14 days.
And when you say you were told, who told you that?
The provider that tested me?
Okay. Did you ever receive a quarantine order from Metro Public Health?
No, I did not.
Okay. Did you ever have to sign anything after you tested positive saying that you were, agreeing to quarantine for these 14 days?
No, I did not.
Did anyone from any department ever check in on you, call you, go to your house during those 14 days while you were quarantining?
No.
Did you ever notice any police patrolling outside your home during that time to make sure that you were doing what you were supposed to be doing?
No.
Okay. So the only quarantine that you had was directed, sort of a suggestion by your provider. It was not a formal order by the state of Tennessee or Metro Public Health?
No, it wasn't.
Nothing further.
All right. Cross-examination.
Did you have a place to stay during your quarantine?
Yes, I did.
And was that your own personal residence?
Yes.
And did you follow all the rules of quarantine?
Yes.
Those are my questions, Your Honor.
All right. Can you redirect? Thank you. You can step down. Call your next witness.
That is our business.
All right. Why don't we take a 10-minute break? And then we'll begin on the state's case.
Recess.
Yeah, without air conditioning, feedback, what it is. I'm definitely here, anything that offsets it, just whatever that word. Wow.
Y'all done?
No.
Yeah, we're still letting down, we're going to start the stage through.
Well, I think I can do that by myself. You gotta let me know.
Yes, sir. Is there any way to find out the name of the next station in the No, I'm waiting on a lawyer.
Who's that? Okay. You got Nathan's, number? He should be here, yeah, he should be here. Yes, sir. If you need anything, let me know. If I see him, I tell him you look. Hi, Ben. Have a good day. Yeah. So I think that to keep Mr.
Cool.
swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, so help you God?
All right.
Dr. Caldwell, would you please state and spell your name for the record?
My name is Michael Caldwell. It's Caldwell.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a physician, and I'm currently the Director of Public Health and the Chief Medical Officer for Nashville-Davidson County.
Can you tell the court about your educational background?
I have a bachelor's in medical degree, a master's in public health. I went through training in internal medicine and preventive medicine.
And when did you become the Director of Health for Metro Nashville?
My orientation day was the day of the tornado on March 3rd. My official day of starting was Monday, March 9th.
And can you tell the court what your duties are as the Director of Health?
I oversee the Metro Nashville Public Health Department, and I serve as the Chief Medical Officer for the community.
Your Honor, at this time, I would offer Dr. Caldwell as an expert in the fields of internal medicine and public health.
Any objection? All right, he'll be approved as an expert.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Caldwell, what is COVID-19?
COVID-19 is an infectious disease virus that typically infects the respiratory system, but also the gastrointestinal system, and is highly infectious and has a high level of fatality rate.
And can you tell the court how COVID-19 is spread?
It is spread primarily through air droplets, and also learning more about it being spread through the air, as well as through touching surfaces, and perhaps gastrointestinally also.
Is COVID-19 considered a pandemic?
Yes.
What does that mean?
That means that the disease is widespread throughout the world and is uncontrolled.
Has Nashville-Davidson County been spared of COVID-19?
Not yet.
Can you tell the court how it has affected Nashville-Davidson County?
Well, the President of the United States, the Governor, the Mayor, and the Board of Health have all issued emergency declarations regarding this public health emergency. And on March 5th was the first identified case in the state of Tennessee. On March 8th was the first identified case in Nashville-Davidson County. And it has required extreme measures to control the virus and to suppress the disease, to limit the overflow of our medical institutions, as well as to limit the amount of disability and death due to the disease.
Since we got our first case here in Nashville-Davidson County, have there been others?
Yes.
And has that been few or many?
Many.
Okay. And based on the many positive cases of COVID-19, has that required you and others to come up with a plan on how Nashville could handle this pandemic?
Yes.
Can you tell the court a little bit about that?
Yes. Through the declarations of the President of the United States, the Governor, the Mayor, and primarily working with the Nashville-Davidson County Board of Health, there was an emergency meeting to declare a public health emergency. With that, setting in motion was public health orders that I worked with the Board of Health, my team at the Department of Health, the Office of the Mayor, and Metro Legal to assure that the public health orders were in keeping with the needs of the disease at the time, as well as followed all legal requirements.
Have the orders been meant to hurt people or help people?
The public health orders have been issued to protect the health of the public.
What is a quarantine?
A quarantine is a specific directive when there is somebody ordered to isolate or keep themselves away from other people for a certain period of time that is determined by the particular germ that we are trying to protect people from.
Are quarantines sometimes necessary? And if they are, Dr. Caldwell, can you tell us why?
Yes, quarantines are necessary at times to control disease spread, especially when they are spread through respiratory and gastrointestinal routes.
What is a health directive?
A health directive is issued to an individual who has either tested positive or has come into close contact with somebody who's positive, to direct them to be isolating and quarantining for a certain period of time determined by the science available to assure that we reduce the risk of transmission of disease in the community.
Okay. And while various orders have been, that you've mentioned here today, coming from the president, the governor, the mayor, the health department, is that different than a particular directive?
It's different in the way that it is directed to an individual person.
Okay. So the orders cover everybody, a directive covers an individual person?
Yes.
I want to turn your attention to the fairgrounds. Was there an area set up at the Nashville Fairgrounds?
Yes, there was an area set up for the fairgrounds specifically to provide additional social distancing capacity for the homeless in the community who are well as a designated area for those who are either under investigation for a positive COVID test, in addition to an area designated for those who had a positive COVID test.
Why was there a need to set this area up at the fairgrounds?
There was a need to set this area up because we knew that the existing homeless shelters did not have the capacity to properly social distance, so there needed to be an expansion of space that was safe, well monitored, and comfortable for those people experiencing homeless to have another option to protect them and have special social distancing. But in addition, because people who might be under investigation of being positive or were positive needed to be quarantined, Metro Nashville Davidson County set up a specific place, a part of the Nashville Fairgrounds that was monitored by medical professionals in a safe environment that allowed the COVID positive individuals who had nowhere else to go to be able to serve out their quarantine time in an environment that was very well maintained, well protected, and provided all of the needs and comfort for them, not only internally, but they also had an ability to go outside at times they wanted to.
Okay, and you mentioned that it was also staffed by medical professionals?
Yes, that's correct, especially that, well, actually the whole grounds was, but specifically the area where we had the COVID positive individuals, where they're designated. We have contract with, I believe, is St. Thomas Ascension, EMTs and nurses, not only to greet arrivals there and orient them and inform them, but also to be there available to them 24 hours a day in case they had any needs.
Okay. And when you say if they had any needs, if somebody began to experience severe symptoms, would they be cared for?
Yes, that would be one example. Another would be someone just needed medicines, or they may needed to contact someone. They were there for them 24 hours a day.
Okay. Can you describe how it was set up at the fairgrounds, or what it looked like?
Yes, I can. Well, of course, I said there was essentially 3 sections at the fairgrounds. There was a section that was for the well people, and then a middle section where most of the people had their meals, and then a section for the COVID positive and people under investigation section that was separated from the ability to cross-contaminate air. But in this area, it was very large and separated out very well. And in addition to there being bedding, there was special extra spacing put forth. So in the COVID positive area, we went beyond the 6 feet requirement. We went to about 10 or 14 feet between individuals' spaces, as well as there were special curtain rods to give them extra privacy as well. So once an individual arrived there, they were greeted by the emergency medical technicians, the nurses, the staff of social services from Metro Nashville Social Services, which also was available 24/7. And not only were the individuals provided a health directive, a written health directive of what was expected and required of them, but there was a placard in more than one location, very large, which made it very clear that this was a quarantine facility and under what legal jurisdictions or orders or laws or regulations that was placard quarantine area was put up. And in addition, there were multiple documents that were attached to that placard to assure that the individuals there had access to all the information and regulations and laws that went along with that placard designation of quarantine.
I'm going to pass up a photograph to you, Dr. Caldwell. Can you look at this and tell the court whether or not this is a fair and accurate depiction of the area that you've just described?
Yes, this is exactly the area where people that would be arriving to this facility would be greeted by the medical technicians. And this is an example of one of the placards, as well as the hanging legal documents that support the placard statement. And this was located at one or more places. And you could see in this picture also how the spaces and curtains were separated to provide some privacy for each of the individuals there.
And I would offer that photograph as exhibit number 3.
All right, it'll be admitted.
If somebody wanted to use a telephone to call anybody, but did not have a personal telephone in order to do that, would that be available to a person at the fairgrounds facility?
Yes, and I've confirmed this on more than one occasion. There was a social services worker that's always available to provide that assistance, as well as the staff of the St. Thomas Ascension Medical Center were always right there and could assist with any communication needs that any of the participants had, and often did.
So Dr. Caldwell, if anyone were to think that if you were put in quarantine at the fairgrounds, you're just thrown into a room for 7 days and then opened up 7 days later, that would be inaccurate.
That would not be correct.
Okay. I want to call your attention to this particular case involving Mr. Kirkley. Was he issued a written directive?
Yes, he was.
Can you tell the court why he was issued a directive?
He was issued a directive because during the testing at the men's shelter, his test had come back positive.
And there has been some talk in the hearing today about some people receiving written directives and some people receiving a verbal directive. Can you tell the court why there's a difference, or why some people receive a written one and some people get a verbal one?
Everybody should receive a written directive, and in circumstances there were sometimes verbal ones done. But in this particular circumstance, we wanted to take extra special care to assure that those people who were the guests of the Metro shelter and this quarantine center we clearly documented that they received the quarantine letter, and not only provided them their original, but we made copies to assure that we properly documented who was on our facility, because this is the only quarantine facility that was under the control of Metro government.
Okay. So there are some people can quarantine at home, some people are quarantining in the hospital.
Yes, that's correct.
But this is the only one operated by Metro.
This is the only designated quarantine place in Metro at government, and it is able to be scaled to size depending on how many people might need it at a particular time.
Your Honor, may Dr. Caldwell be handed exhibit number 2?
Yes.
Thank you.
You've just been handed what's been already entered into evidence, Dr. Caldwell, is exhibit number 2 to this hearing. Can you tell us what were the 3 specific directives that were given to Mr. Kirkley?
Yes, 3 specific directives are to remain in quarantine at the fairgrounds under isolation until further notice from me or from the staff at the Metro Public Health Department. That to call the Metro Public Health Department as soon as possible if there were any questions, if you have not spoken with them already. And there's a number there to call. You must follow the instructions and requirements as part of this directive. And you must cooperate with the Department of Public Health in identifying any individuals with who you have come into contact with during the infectious period, which began 2 days before symptom onset.
Okay. Did you have any personal contact with Mr. Kirkley?
Yes, I did.
Can you tell the court how that came about?
Yes, I made a visit to the men's rescue mission to check and see how their process was going, informing their patients or guests who were testing negative. I was informed that all those who had tested positive had been transported to the quarantine center. So I was wanting to show my support to the rescue mission and the leadership there. And I identified Mr. Norman Humber, and he gave me a tour of the facility, informing me on how the procedures were going. I was then, both of us were sort of flagged down by another member of the National Rescue Mission saying, oh, we have 2 additional guests who we had lost track of. They've just come back. They've just reappeared. They're on our positive list. And so one of those was Mr. Kirkley, who had identified himself as Hank, so I know him as Hank, and one other gentleman. And so Mr. Humbert and I, knowing that the transportation of all the other positives had occurred, there was not transportation available to assist these 2 new individuals to go to the quarantine center, although it needed to happen immediately. So Mr. Humbert and I decided that we would ourselves transport both of these individuals ourselves from the National Rescue Mission to the quarantine site at the fairgrounds. So I had an opportunity to spend some time, probably 30 to 45 minutes with both of these individuals to try to talk to them, to find out about them, and to assure that they were comfortable and understood, what we were doing.
And you said that you spent about 30 or 45 minutes with Mr. Kirkley and this other individual.
Yes.
During that period of time, did you talk to him about whether or not he had any other place to go?
Yes, my recollection is that.
Hold on just one second.
That's any statements that Mr. Kirkley made specifically on both the Fifth Amendment and then also the state objection. These statements that Mr. Kirkley made, he testified obviously to what his statements, but that's, he testified to what Mr. Kirkley said out of court, that we have those statements.
Isn't that an admission?
I don't believe it has to be an admission per se, I think it's a statement out of court, and that's an out of court statement. If it's being, asserted for the truth of the matter, then that would be hearsay. It doesn't have to be necessarily an admission.
General?
It's a statement by a party opponent.
Overruled.
So you had an opportunity to speak with Mr. Kirkley.
Yes, we were just having congenial conversations, both him and this other gentleman. And I take my role as a director of public health very seriously, and I care very much about the community and the homeless population. I even have participated in the point in time count in January, so I was very familiar with the homeless population. And being a physician, I have a real, not only a duty, but a personal sense of wanting to connect with patients. So at that time, I felt that they were my patients, for lack of another way of thinking of it. So yes, I often try to get to know them, and I got to know Mr. Kirkley and this other gentleman, asked about, how they are, how they're doing. And it would come up naturally that, are you comfortable here? What other places are there, that can help you? So it seemed to be very congenial, positive, helpful, and pleasant.
Did you have a conversation with Mr. Kirkley about whether or not he had another place to go other than the fairgrounds?
I don't believe I asked him that specific question, but it was clear that were there somewhere else to go, that we would have been able to bring him wherever he would want to go.
Okay. Did you make that offer, in whatever words you actually used, clear to Mr. Kirkley that it was available to him, he could be taken somewhere else by you?
Well, it was clear to me. I'm not sure if it was clear to him.
The directive that was given to Mr. Kirkley, did it have instructions on it on what he could do if he wanted to dispute the directive?
Yes.
And did he dispute the directive?
No.
Was it an option for him to request a review by the Metropolitan Board of Health?
Yes.
And is that in his written directive?
Yes.
Did he do that?
No.
Having Mr. Kirkley ordering Mr. Kirkley to spend his quarantine period at the fairgrounds, in your expert opinion, was that the least restrictive constraint on his liberty at that time?
Overruled. Overruled.
Was that the least restrictive?
Yes.
Yes, it was.
Those are my questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Morning, Dr. Caldwell. Have you been in the court listening to the testimony today? Have you heard the other witnesses testify?
Yes.
Okay. You heard Mr. Call testify about his involvement with the Homelessness Planning Council.
Yes.
Are you aware of what that council is and what it does?
I have some basic knowledge, and I've interacted with them actually prior to me becoming the director of public health.
Okay. You heard that they're sort of an independent body of Metro government.
Right.
And that they're involved with addressing issues that relate to the homeless population
Yes,
in
I
Nashville.
participated in some of their meetings.
Okay. That would include things like the COVID-19 pandemic and how that affects the homeless population specifically?
Well, I attended their meetings prior to me becoming Director of Public Health, so I was never a part of the meetings after that.
Okay. And again, that was on March 9th, was your official start date as the
Yes.
Director of Public Health? So you never consulted with them about the development of the fairgrounds facility, correct?
Indirectly, I consulted with Chief Swan and Chief Survey at the Office of Emergency Management, where all of the decisions were being made for the emergency.
Okay, so Chief Swan and the other individual you mentioned, they're at the Office of Emergency Management?
Yes, Chief Survey and Chief Swan are the directors of the Office of Emergency Management, the Emergency Operations Center.
Okay.
And the homeless population was within their purview with our input.
Okay, so those individuals, are they members of the Homelessness Planning Council?
I don't know.
Okay, so again, you personally never consulted with the Homelessness Planning Council about the fairgrounds facility, correct?
I can say that I participated in conversations at the Office of Emergency Operations where all parties were participating, but I did not specifically speak to the council separately.
Okay, yeah, you never went, like you said, you've been to some of their meetings after
Right.
this?
No, yeah. So once there was the emergency and this moved to the Office of Emergency Management, the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, all those conversations and decisions happen in that environment. So people get tasked with different duties. So I knew that those duties of trying to identify the issues, what to do about the many issues around homelessness were a part of the EOCs.
Okay, so your testimony is that they were involved in some capacity in this planning and development of the fairgrounds facility. Is that correct or no?
I don't know as a body, but individuals who may be a part of that coalition were just talked to or communicated to.
Okay, and when you say communicated to, does that mean they were involved in the planning, or does that mean that you told them that the fairgrounds facility was happening?
I did not tell anyone that anything was happening. It was a decision by the Office of Emergency Management.
Okay, so again, you were not involved in consulting the Homelessness Planning Council about the development of the fairgrounds facility, correct?
The Planning Council as a body, no.
Okay. Are you aware they sent an open letter to the mayor's office about their frustration with not being
Objection to
involved?
relevance, Your Honor.
I'm going to overrule. He knows.
I'll repeat the question. Are you aware they sent an open letter to the mayor's office about the fact that they were frustrated that they were not involved with the planning of the fairgrounds facility?
I knew there were a lot of communications regarding the issue of homelessness, and there were a lot of opinions about what should be done.
Okay, so are you aware of that open letter they sent to the mayor or no?
I know there was a lot of communications. I'm not sure I know that specific one.
Okay, did you hear through whatever medium of communication that that body was frustrated about not being involved in that planning?
And Your Honor, now I'm going to object to relevance again. Whether somebody's frustrated has nothing to do with whether or not this defendant's constitutional rights were violated.
Sustained.
You understand that there are many organizations in Nashville that serve the homeless population?
I am aware of that.
Okay. Organizations like the Nashville Rescue Mission, correct?
Oh, yes.
Open Table, are you familiar with that organization?
Not as well.
Okay.
No.
But you've heard of them?
Well, today I did too,
Okay.
yes.
Today was the first time you've ever heard of Open Table?
No, not the first time, but I learned more about them.
Okay. What did you know about them prior to today?
Relevance, Your Honor.
That's absolutely relevant, Your Honor, if he doesn't know.
Overruled.
That they're a participant with the Homeless Coalition.
That was the extent of your understanding of that organization prior to today.
The open table?
Yes.
That's right.
Okay. You're familiar with Salvation Army prior to today?
Yes?
And then obviously many others in the community as well.
Well, there are many where the community is very lucky to have a rich resource of organizations that are dedicated to serving the homeless population.
We are. But you never consulted with any of those organizations about the Fairgrounds facility, right?
Well, as part of the Emergency Operations Center, we have many duties, and the duty to decide about the homeless shelter was designated to Chief Swan and Chief Survey, and I provided guidance from a medical perspective.
To your knowledge, did they consult with any of these organizations?
I know that they were communicating with every relevant organization on a one-to-one basis, yes.
Okay, and that was prior to the development of the Fairgrounds facility?
Throughout. Chief Survey is the one who is most knowledgeable to know who is communicated to at what time, but I was always assured that we were communicating, and I knew that there were disagreements about what should be done.
Was Mr. Kirkley or any other individual experiencing homelessness given a hearing before they were brought to the Fairgrounds facility?
No.
Were any of them informed that that was an option that they had?
Only with the directive.
And that directive, as we discussed, is to challenge after they've already been transported to the Fairgrounds facility, correct?
In this case, it was, right.
You mentioned something on direct about a social worker always being available to talk to individuals there. Were individuals informed of the right that they had to, the right they had to use the social worker to try to challenge the order?
Well, it was written there.
Okay. Do you know if Mr. Kirkley can read?
No, I do not know that.
Okay. Was it the entire quarantine order at any point read aloud to him?
I did not present that to him. Other staff did.
Other staff read the entire quarantine order aloud to him?
I don't know. I said present.
Oh, okay, okay. The mechanism for review that's included in the quarantine order, that's a mechanism to either email the board, correct?
But are you talking about the directive?
The directive, yes.
Oh, okay. Is there one specific place you're?
I believe it's on the second page.
Yes.
There's a mechanism for review.
Yes, it's there's options to email or to call.
Or to call.
It says if you lack email access.
Okay, and again, that's after someone has already been in quarantine, ordered to quarantine, and after someone is already at the fairgrounds in Mr. Kirkley's case.
In this case, yes.
Just a moment, Your Honor. I just want to clarify an answer you just gave. So you said that you were not the person who presented the quarantine order to Mr. Kirkley, correct?
Directive, no, I was not.
Okay, so you don't know whether or not that was ever read aloud to him?
I don't know that.
Okay. You testified that the fairgrounds facility was the least restrictive means. How did you come to that decision?
There needed to be a designated site that was under Metro control to assure that quarantine was safe as well as comfortable, and provided medical care. And that was the only option available to assure that.
I think those are all my questions, Your Honor.
All right. Anything else?
No redirect, Your Honor.
Thank you. You step down, Dr. Caldwell.
Am I done?
Yes.
Oh, here you go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Your Honor, that's the state's proof.
All right. Any rebuttal proof?
No rebuttal, Your Honor, sorry.
All right. Are you ready to argue now, or do you need a break? All right, we'll take a 10-minute break and come back for argument.
All right.
They're asking.
For recess.
So I'm hanging out.
Your Honor, as set forth in our memorandum of law, Mr. Kirkley has asserted 7 separate claims of unconstitutional conduct related to this prosecution. So I'm just going to address each of those claims in turn based on the testimony that we heard today. The first claim is an equal protection claim, and that claim is really twofold. First, our position is that it's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause to allow individuals with housing stability the right to choose their place of quarantine, either at home, with family, and to deny that same right to individuals experiencing homelessness like Mr. Kirkley. You heard testimony from several witnesses today that these individuals were not given an opportunity. Mr. Kirkley was not given an opportunity to quarantine elsewhere. He was not given the opportunity to choose where he was going to quarantine. He was told that he was going to quarantine at the fairgrounds facility. You heard Reverend Cranfield and Mr. Humber testify that they were instructed that this is what was happening, that it was required that these individuals would be brought to the fairgrounds facility. You heard some testimony today from Dr. Caldwell that he had a conversation with Mr. Kirkley specifically, but the testimony that I heard, I don't think supports an argument that he was actually asked if he had another place to go. I think you heard Dr. Caldwell say, well, is it clear to me? And I didn't ask that exact question, but it was clear to me. I don't think that that's sufficient, and I don't think that Dr. Caldwell testified in detail to a conversation that he had with Mr. Kirkley about whether Mr. Kirkley had an alternative place to quarantine and whether he wanted to quarantine using the other options that were testified to by Ms. Adcock, by Mr. Call, and I'll get into that testimony a little later on.
And while you're talking about equal protection, in order for, tell me what your position is on the, I guess, the standard of review for this court when we're dealing with an equal protection claim challenging the treatment of someone based on homelessness or poverty.
Yes. So we can see that it's rational basis. I think the Supreme Court has pretty clearly said that wealth is not a protected class. It's not a suspect class. So it's rational basis. But rational basis still means something. And we've cited a couple of cases, both from the Supreme Court and in Tennessee in our brief, particularly City of Cleburne, that irrational prejudice, where there's just no rational reason why people are being treated disparately, that fails rational basis review. And our position is to not ask the question, to not engage in a conversation with each of these individuals and to say, look, you need to quarantine. You've tested positive. Here are your options. Maybe those options are more limited for someone who does not have housing stability, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the right to choose, the way that every other Nashvilleian with stability in housing was given the opportunity to say, hey, I live here, or hey, I'm going to stay at my mom's place. They were given that right, and Mr. Kirkley was denied that right. And our position is that's not rational. It's not rational to not ask the question. It's not rational to just make assumptions, as Ms. McCormick testified. Just make an assumption that someone who's staying at a homeless shelter only wants to go quarantine at the fairgrounds. You heard about alternative means of quarantine. You heard about individual encampment. You heard about funding that was available for individual hotel rooms. Again, to not ask the question and to not make those options, at the very least, a part of the conversation.
Everyone else, though, the other residents who testified and the testimony was that the staff had an address, had a separate address. But the people who were guests at the mission, that was their address, and that's not a safe place for them to be.
Correct.
So, and the doctor testified, did he not, that he made the decision they needed a safe environment, well protected, well maintained, staffed. Is that not a rational reason for choosing to relocate those individuals who were living at the mission to another safe place?
Again, I think our position is that the irrationality comes in with not even asking the question. It's a very simple question. It's a very simple conversation. And I don't think that Dr. Caldwell testified to the fact that he had that specific conversation. He said, I thought it was clear. I'm not sure if I asked that specific question. That's not clear from the testimony, and to not engage in that conversation, that is sort of the first prong of our equal protection argument. I think the second prong, which frankly is stronger in my view, is the fact that they're not issuing formal quarantine orders with the power and the threat of criminal prosecution to individuals who are not experiencing homelessness. That is the part, I think, that is particularly irrational. To issue a quarantine order for someone to stay at the fairgrounds facility and then to just instruct the mission, hey, follow your own policy, I guess tell your folks to stay home, but we have no enforcement mechanism for that because they didn't sign orders and they weren't issued to them. That is the part that I think really violates the Equal Protection Clause under City of Claiborne. So those are the grounds for that first equal protection claim. Our second claim is a substantive due process claim under the 14th Amendment. The legal basis for that is set forth in our memo of law, but just briefly, I don't really think that there's an argument here that Mr. Kirkley's freedom of movement was restricted. It obviously was, or he couldn't have been arrested for the case that we are here for today.
But everyone's freedom of movement is restricted when there's a quarantine order.
Correct.
You're not disputing that quarantine orders are lawful. I mean, quarantine orders have been approved by the Supreme Court, for more than a century, right?
Correct. They do need to be narrowly tailored, though, because it's strict scrutiny, because this is a fundamental right. There's a fundamental right to move freely intra and interstate. And again, the legal authority for that is in our brief. But it has to be narrowly tailored. And again, we're not saying that no quarantine order under any circumstances is constitutional. What we're saying is that when you restrict people's fundamental rights, it has to be done narrowly tailored, and it has to be done in a way that is the least drastic means of accomplishing that compelling state interest. Again, I don't think that we are arguing that protecting folks from a global deadly pandemic is a compelling state interest. What we're arguing is that the way that it was done in this case was not narrowly tailored. The state had the burden. The state has the burden for when it's a fundamental right and when we were talking about strict scrutiny. They have the burden of showing that there were no other less restrictive means available. And all we heard from the state's witness, from Dr. Caldwell, is just sort of a statement that there were no other less restrictive means. We heard testimony from folks that the Homelessness Planning Council, the very body that's tasked with addressing the needs of this population, was never consulted in whether or not the fairgrounds was the least restrictive means necessary. You heard Ms. Adcock testify to the fact that there were other less restrictive means. There was funding available for individuals to stay in actual hotel rooms where they could actually have their own bathroom and have a shower and have their own bed and not be in a sort of open space with cots that are 6 feet apart. The fact that those were just not investigated at all, that I think just does not comport with the strict scrutiny analysis.
Does the government have an obligation to investigate those types of amenities in the middle of an emergency?
I think so, Your Honor. I mean, I think constitutional strict scrutiny applies even in emergencies. I think, what that looks like and what the least drastic means are in an emergency may be different than what they are outside of an emergency, but they still have to be the least drastic means given the totality of the circumstances. And again, given the totality of the circumstances here, to just not engage with the thought leaders in our community. Dr. Caldwell testified that we are very blessed to have many, many, many organizations in our community that do this work, that are committed to helping our neighbors experiencing homelessness. And for those organizations to not be a part of the decision-making process, that is what fails strict scrutiny. That is what is not the least restrictive means. And that is the basis for our substantive due process.
I mean, I guess I'm trying to, there's got to be some balance there. When we're talking about a public health emergency with a highly contagious disease that Dr. Caldwell testified could be deadly. I mean, are we really just talking about amenities? Is that you want a private bathroom versus a place that's safe and clean and has social workers? I mean, those are the choices that you're giving the court in terms of alternatives.
I think the choices that were at least testified to today. And again,
quarantine is never a choice. I mean, right. The quarantine directive is always against someone's will.
Correct.
The question is just where it is.
Correct. And I think there was no investigation of the other available alternatives. There were alternatives. And I want to be very clear, Your Honor, we had no obligation. We had no burden to come in here and prove that there were other alternatives available. That is the state's burden when we're talking about strict scrutiny. They did not bring in any witnesses. that testified that, look, we talked to the Homelessness Planning Council. We talked to every organization in Nashville. Dr. Caldwell didn't even know about Open Table before he came in here today. He said the majority of his knowledge about the organization he learned sitting in court today. That is the part that is unconstitutional. It's that lack of outreach, that lack of knowledge, that lack of engagement. And again, it's the state's burden, not ours, and we don't believe that they've met that here today. Our third claim is a procedural due process claim under the 14th Amendment. Again, all the relevant authorities are in our brief. Again, I don't think there's a dispute here that this is an infringement on his liberty interest, which is protected under the 14th Amendment. There's lots of case law that forcible transport of an individual, even in civil contexts for medical reasons, kind of like the civil commitment proceedings that we have for commitment to MTMHI, that's a deprivation of a liberty interest. So I don't think that that's contested. And because it's a deprivation of the liberty interest, it's protected by the 14th Amendment and the procedural due process requirements of the 14th Amendment. Mr. Kirkley was entitled to proper notice and a pre-deprivation hearing. And I think that's really critical. The fact that he had a review mechanism after he was removed, required to be removed from the mission to the fairgrounds facility, that is not sufficient. And we've cited a lot of authority in our brief, but the only times where a pre-deprivation or post-deprivation hearing is appropriate is when we're talking about property. When we're talking about liberty, it has to be pre-deprivation. That's what we do for our civil commitment cases. It's what we do in any other context where someone's liberty is being infringed upon, because our liberty is really important. And the idea that someone's entitled to proper notice and, again, a pre-deprivation hearing, I think is well supported by the authorities that are cited in our brief.
Is your argument on notice the fact that he didn't receive this piece of paper till he got to the fairgrounds, or the fact that he wasn't advised of the consequences of the result of a test?
I think all of the above, Your Honor. I think that he wasn't notified that, if you get a positive, you're going to be involuntarily removed from the Nashville Rescue Mission. I think it's the fact that he got the quarantine order after he's already arrived there. I think it's the fact that several witnesses have testified to the fact that this all happened. I mean, they were told the night before that this testing was going to happen. They were then tested that morning, and then when the results came in, it was a matter of hours, I believe Ms. McCormick testified to, that they decided, oh, everyone who tested positive is going to be headed to the mission. I think that is not proper notice. And again, even if that is proper notice, he certainly did not receive a pre-deprivation hearing. I believe the state asked some questions about the fact that, did he request a pre-deprivation hearing? I don't think that the obligation is on the individual under procedural due process analysis to actually request that hearing. I don't think he was actually ever informed. We don't have any testimony that actually confirms that Mr. Kirkley could read the quarantine order, and we don't have any testimony that confirms that it was actually read aloud to him, or that he was even informed of his right to have a pre-deprivation hearing, because I believe the state's position is that he had a review mechanism after the fact. So again, all of the above, it's kind of an amalgamation of all of those factors that render this deficient under the procedural due process requirements of the 14th Amendment.
And does the fact that this was a relatively short period of confinement, doesn't that play into this, the due process, the level of process depends upon the nature and the extent of the deprivation? Obviously, this deprivation is going to end at some point. I mean, it's not going to, it wasn't indefinite.
Well, respectfully, Your Honor,
the incubation period, right?
Well,
it depends on his health situation.
But respectfully, the order itself says an indefinite period. There is no specific timeline in that order. It says for an indefinite period. That's the language in the order. And so he was, even assuming that we're following CDC guidelines and assuming that Mr. Kirkley knew what the CDC guidelines were at the time, the notice, quote unquote, that he was given doesn't specify how long he's going to be there. And again, I think that the bigger issue is that we're talking about forcible removal from one place to another, a deprivation of liberty. And I think the fact that it's a deprivation of liberty itself makes procedural due process all the more critical. And again, that's why the authorities that we've cited have said, look, post-deprivation is not good enough when we're talking about a liberty interest. It has to be pre-deprivation because it's that important. Our next claim is a First Amendment claim about Mr. Kirkley's right to freely associate. This claim is also twofold. First, as supported by the authorities in our memorandum of law, the right to freely associate under the First Amendment includes a right to choose to cohabitate and associate with family members. Again, we heard testimony from Dr. Caldwell that he had some conversation, but we never got any clarity about the exact questions that he asked, whether he asked whether Mr. Kirkley had a family member that he could safely quarantine with. And you also heard testimony from other witnesses that folks who did assert that right, who did say, hey, I have a family member, I have a parent that I can potentially stay with.
The problem is Mr. Kirkley tested positive. This wasn't a situation where it was unknown. I mean, you're suggesting that he should have the right to choose to go and stay somewhere where he's going to necessarily infect someone else?
Yes, Your Honor, because that's the right that's been given to every other Nashvilleian with housing stability. So if I tested positive, if I went down to Nissan Stadium and I tested positive, I would be allowed to quarantine in my home with my husband, who is probably going to get infected because we live together. And that's a choice that I'm allowed to make because I have a house. And that's a choice that Mr. Kirkley was not allowed to make because he's experiencing homelessness. And that is the disparate treatment that we're talking about here today. That is the part that violates both the First Amendment, the equal protection claim. It's because he's not given this choice that everybody else in Nashville with housing stability is given. That's the issue.
What if Metro Nashville enforced it across the board? I mean, they would have the authority to do that. You agree, would you not? The quarantine orders. I mean, I guess I'm starting from the assumption that quarantine orders are lawful. It is a valid exercise of the police authority to protect the health and welfare and safety of the community. So quarantine orders are lawful.
So long as they comport with the Constitution.
If Metro Nashville chose to, they could have subjected everyone to a quarantine order and placed them at a quarantine location. Is that what, I mean, they could. Do you dispute that they could or couldn't do that?
I think that certainly would cure the equal protection issue, for sure.
They have that authority. In a matter of in an emergency situation when you're dealing with an infectious disease, the statute allows the government to set up places of quarantine and gives the authority to issue quarantine orders. Correct?
Again, if they comport with the Constitution. So I think that all of the claims that we have here today are the ways in which Metro Public Health didn't do their job in compliance with the Constitution.
So we're talking about, what we're talking about is really sort of your equal protection argument, your selective application argument.
Yep.
Right?
And then also, I think if that were Metro Nashville's policy, I think they would have to give everyone a pre-deprivation hearing under the 14th Amendment. I think that they would, I don't think that they could say, unless, again, under strict scrutiny, unless it was the least restrictive means, I don't think that they could say everyone must quarantine at this, government facility that we've created for everyone in Nashville. Again, I think each of the claims, they're specific because of the conduct in this case. So, and it's context-based, right? So when we're talking about strict scrutiny, least restrictive means could mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. Perhaps in a real emergency where there are no other options, yes, that would be the least restrictive means, and that would be constitutional. That's not what happened here, because we have lots of testimony that, number one, they didn't even investigate other less restrictive means, and number two, that less restrictive means were available. That's what violates the Constitution. And I can move on to the second prong of our First Amendment argument, which is that there's really strong case law in our circuit and the Sixth Circuit that functionally denying somebody access to an attorney also violates this right to freely associate. That case is United States v. Johnson. It's discussed at length in our brief. And I think that case is particularly important because it talks about this right in the context of someone who is actually experiencing homelessness. It talks about it in the context of someone who doesn't have practically the ability to pick up the phone and call their attorney, or to hop on their computer and shoot their attorney an email when they need legal assistance. You heard testimony from Glenn Cranfield, who toured the fairgrounds facility right around the time that Mr. Kirkley was quarantined. He testified that there were no phones, no computers, no mechanism for someone experiencing homelessness to access an attorney. Again, we also don't know whether Mr. Kirkley was even advised. We don't know if he knew that he had the right to review this decision, because we don't know if he was actually read the quarantine order or if he understood the review mechanism of the quarantine order. And, you know, we did hear some testimony from Dr. Caldwell about, oh, well, there's a social worker and they're available and, you know, someone could use their cell phone. But again, the fact that that person exists doesn't cure the issue of whether Mr. Kirkley understands that he actually has access to an advocate who could help him challenge this quarantine order. As far as
Does he contest the positive result? I mean, what would he be challenging? Just that he didn't want to go to the fairgrounds?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I think so. And, you know, again, we haven't gotten all the discovery, but I don't know. I haven't seen the positive results. So, you know, potentially that would be a contest as well. But for the purposes of this hearing today, yes, it would be the fact that he could have some other place to quarantine other than being required to quarantine at the fairgrounds facility. Our fifth and sixth arguments are about unconstitutional warrantless searches and seizures. So our position is that the search would be obviously the warrantless mandatory COVID-19 testing. You heard testimony that that was not something that someone could refuse. It was mandatory. Everybody had to comply. Again, there's very clear case law. I don't think that they're seriously contesting that, you know, a mandatory medical test would be a search under the Fourth Amendment. I think there's clear case law on that, both federally and also, you know, in the context of, for example, DUI laws when we're talking about blood draws, warrantless, you know, blood draws, that those have to be either consensual or they have to go get a warrant from a neutral magistrate.
Have you found any case law, and I know it's all new, but, you know, just in the context of maybe not COVID, but of other contagions, maybe Ebola. I know there's some cases on that and tuberculosis, but cases dealing with mandatory testing.
I did not see any that were mandatory testing. I did find some related to Ebola. Those are cited in our brief, where they did apply a Fourth Amendment analysis to the seizure of in a similar situation of quarantine.
The seizure in the quarantine.
Correct.
Related to quarantine.
In that case, it was, I believe it was procedurally, I think it was a 1983 claim. Okay. So obviously the standard was much different. But yes, those cases are cited in our brief in those sections for those claims. And they did apply a Fourth Amendment.
But you haven't seen anything related to the actual test?
No, Your Honor, not that I found. I'm happy to continue searching, but.
Metro Nashville be authorized to mandate testing for everyone?
I think if they had probable cause to get, you know, a warrant, for example, I think absolutely there would have been probable cause. You know, say you have a positive test at the mission and they say, okay, wait a minute, we got to shut this down. We got to make sure that we got to know who in the mission was exposed. We got to know who's positive. We have to know who to quarantine. They have to go in front of a neutral magistrate and actually get a warrant to have that done. I mean, it's done in DUI cases. It can be done very quickly. There's no reason that it couldn't have been done here. And again, that was the state's burden. And they haven't put on any witness, any testimony today that refutes these claims, that refutes that a warrant should have been gotten here. Frankly, I think they've sort of waived argument on that because they haven't presented any testimony that's responsive to those two claims.
Go ahead.
So those are our fifth and sixth claims of unconstitutionality. The seventh one is our Eighth Amendment claim. I think that was sort of a purely legal claim, so we'll just rest on our brief with respect to that. I don't think there was any testimony that would have been dispositive of that here today. So those are the seven claims of unconstitutionality. They're set forth in our memorandum. We've elicited testimony. I think we've gone above and beyond in the cases where we didn't even have the burden to demonstrate that this was unconstitutional, this quarantine order, as it relates to Mr. Kirkley specifically, and the way in which it was conducted in this case is unconstitutional. Our position is that any one of these constitutional infirmities would require dismissal under Whitwell, and the combination of all seven, we believe, commands such a result. I will close in the same way that we closed our memorandum of law. It is emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. That's Marbury v. Madison. And when a court abrogates that duty, the promise of equal justice under law rings hollow, becomes nothing more than a mirage, flickering yet unattainable for those whose voices the majoritarian chorus seeks to drown out. Mr. Kirkley's voice must not be drowned out, nor his constitutional rights trampled in the name of safeguarding public health. To hold otherwise would render the Constitution nothing more than a collection of time-worn adages offering little more than good advice. The court must emphatically reject such de minimis consideration of the supreme law of our land. And in so holding, it should find this prosecution against Mr. Kirkley unconstitutional at its inception under Tennessee v. Whitwell, State v. Whitwell, and accordingly dismiss the pending criminal charge. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Trout. General?
Please, court. Your Honor has reviewed all the pleadings, I'm sure. All one has to do is look around this courtroom to see the changes and the effect that COVID-19 has had on how we live our lives. And the law of quarantine, which is well settled and goes back many, many years, there's no debate about it being a lawful and constitutional approach when there is a serious issue. Tennessee Supreme Court in the State Ex Rel Kennedy v. Head in 1945 said so. It hasn't changed. The statutes have been on the books. Everything from cholera to tuberculosis, venereal disease, as it was called then, and now this pandemic. And throughout the course of history of quarantine, it's a balance between the needs of society with the personal liberties of an individual. And that's what I submit the court and society is weighing in this matter, from the directive from the president, the governor, the mayor, public health department, is how to address this with the safety of the public. Counsel Smith would say, well, if someone tests positive, we're going to have to set up a hearing and a committee and do all this review, and then we'll decide whether or not it's serious enough for the law to take effect.
Why couldn't Metro just have asked the health department, the mission personnel, to discuss the situation with the guests and work out an appropriate arrangement for quarantine, just as they did with the rescue mission staff?
All right, I submit from the testimony that discussion and that was ongoing. And that's why, for the safety of the people at the mission, their guests, the COVID positive individuals with nowhere else to go, Metro set aside.
They weren't asked. Were they? The testimony I heard is they were rounded up, put on a school bus, and taken to the fairgrounds before they even got their quarantine directive.
Because this was a public health emergency.
Why didn't they do it with anyone else? Everyone else, they just said, send a letter to your employee and tell them they need to go quarantine.
Perhaps that should be done and may well be in the process of being done. What we heard here today was those people who were directed to do so had a place to go, and they did discuss. I submit Dr. Caldwell's testimony was that it was clear to him that he discussed with Mr. Kirkley that there were other options. But at this time, with time being of the essence, there was a review, and I think the order, I believe on the first page, says this is 7 days, going back to Your Honor's comment about the duration. This wasn't like, where a tuberculosis where somebody's there for months and months, if not years, in a quarantine. And the testimony was also that Mr. Kirkley never asked for a hearing, never contested it in any manner, anyway, other than, obviously, allegations are that he violated the quarantine order.
At one point during Dr. Caldwell's testimony, he made the comment, and I'm trying to find it in my notes, and I can't find it. He made the comment that it was necessary to have the fairground facility because it was the only place where individuals located there could be under metro control. Why was it necessary to place only our homeless population under metro control?
Actually, I believe every one of us who live and work here in Nashville are under metro control.
Well, wouldn't someone be under metro control in a tent by the river, just as much as anyone else living in a neighborhood?
Enforcing that quarantine, Submit, would be impractical, if not impossible.
Has Metro enforced a quarantine order as to anyone else, violation of a quarantine order for anyone else who is, has an address?
To my knowledge, Mr. Kirkley thus far is the only one who has disobeyed, or at least allegedly disobeyed, the quarantine order.
I mean, do you think that's actually true? I mean, do you think that other people, do you think this is the only arrest because it's the only person who walked away out of quarantine?
I accredit the testimony of the witnesses here today that they obeyed the quarantine directive. And, Your Honor, there are steps, the process, didn't get into that and necessarily, but physical arrest is the last alternative.
But that's what happened, isn't it? It
Yes.
happened, there was a physical arrest that happened immediately after these individuals got their test results. Was
Not
that
immediately.
a physical arrest?
No, Your Honor.
It wasn't? They weren't
Oh,
seized and driven to the fairgrounds?
They were escorted. They were not
Well, then they didn't
taken
have
to
to
the
go.
prison.
They could have gone somewhere else. They didn't have to get on the bus. Is that what you're saying?
If they had somewhere else to go, yes. This is an important issue for preserving public health. Dr. Caldwell is uncontradicted, other than by hypotheticals or insinuation, whatever that, oh, well, yes, you know, the people aren't booking as many hotel rooms, so let's give everybody that. But that this was the least restrictive alternative available. It still is.
Does Metro have the right to conduct non-voluntary tests for COVID?
Judge, I would submit that if someone refused the test, then there would be further steps that could be taken. I think here we have no proof whatsoever that anyone refused the test, and quite frankly,
There was testimony that it was mandatory.
yes, at the mission. For the people who were there at the mission, there had been a positive. And so, yes, I think that is a Metro Health directive, again, from the president, governor, mayor on down, that people can be directed to submit to the test, like people are directed to wear a mask, to socially distance, to not engage in parties while, 25 people, all of those sorts of things.
I guess, I understand exactly what you're saying. I understand there's a serious, and you're right. Look around this courtroom. I've got glass boxes around all of our people. We're all sitting in masks. We are in the middle of a public health emergency. There is no question that quarantine orders are lawful. They've been lawful for many, many years. And
the state's position is just that it is.
The problem that what I'm trying to grapple with is why Metro chose to single out a single component of the Davidson County community and say, we're going to bus you to a location and arrest you if you leave. No one else. I'm sure there are people. I don't have any proof before me, so I'm obviously not going to rest my decision on this. But I'm sure there are people who were, as quarantine was suggested, who probably went to the grocery store. I'm just thinking that's common sense. And I might, obviously that's, and again, it's not before me, and it's not going to form the basis of my opinion, but it just strikes me that this just seems very, very selective and a little heavy-handed. But obviously, I'm going to look at all the legal arguments and analyze each one under their own under their own test. So whether or not it's unlawful, I've not made that determination, but it certainly, just causes you to raise an eyebrow.
State's position is this was helping people, even Mr. Kirkley. And the people Mr. Kirkley could come into contact with. It's to protect the public. And in that balance, I do not believe, Your Honor, respectfully, that this would be one where what I hear counsel saying is that if a person says, I'm homeless, you can't apply the law to me.
Let me ask you just one more thing. And Dr. Caldwell and maybe another witness as well from the health department gave their opinion that this solution was the least restrictive. Does the government have an obligation to investigate alternatives before reaching that, before coming up with that solution? I mean, there obviously were other less restrictive. I mean, just from testimony here, there were less restrictive alternatives available. Had Metro chose to reach out to people with specialized knowledge of this community.
Judge, what I heard is that this was a discussion, a matter that involved many people in arriving at this. And again, like Your Honor was saying, I know you wouldn't base this on it, but we're well aware that when the sheriff offered his unused penal facility as a place of shelter, that was soundly rejected. So that's what I'm saying. This was a matter of not just one person, I submit, sitting down and saying, okay, we got the fairgrounds, there's nothing going on there, let's use that. But back to Mr. Kirkley's situation, do not think that his constitutional rights in any regard have been denied. The prosecution, Judge Holt's ruling, which is where we're going back to, was not an abuse of his discretion in denying the motion to dismiss. And the state would respectfully rely upon its responses and supplemental authorities and commit the matter to Your Honor.
Thank you. Any rebuttal arguments? You don't necessarily have to have it, just asking. All right. Well, I appreciate all the effort, and I've received all the briefs in the case, and I appreciate all the witnesses who came in and testified. This is obviously a very important and complicated issue, and I will get a written decision as quickly as I can. Thank you all very much.
All right. Recess.
Felt like it was back to arguing with the Court of Criminal Appeals. I kept waiting for the little red light to